Welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We're honored today to welcome Geoffrey Moore to the show. He's one of the world's most influential business strategists working at such companies as Microsoft, Intel, and Salesforce. And he's perhaps best known for his work on Crossing the Chasm, which is required reading for tech entrepreneurs and has sold over 1 million copies. Geoff also recently published a philosophy book, which is really interesting for us. It's called The Infinite Staircase, and we're very excited that he's come on the show to talk with us today. Welcome, Geoff.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
We're super excited.
Yeah. So we thought that maybe to kick things off, we'd touch on a comment you made in our pre-meeting that I found really intriguing. Which was that in effect, you're a literary critic, and the way that you show up as a literary critic has informed all of your work, the business work, the philosophy work, and I'm curious to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, my first career was as a teacher of English. I was a professor of English, and then I transitioned into technology. It was sales and marketing and technology. And then this latest thing, and then I became a consultant and was doing consulting. And the latest was the book on philosophy, The Infinite Staircase. All four of those are characterized by a common interest in narratives. So narrative is, to my view, the most important stair in the Infinite Staircase, because it's the vehicle by which we explain things to each other and to ourselves. And it needs discipline. It needs critique. We know that there are conspiracy theories and urban folk tales. So there are narratives that get out of control. But without narrative, we're nowhere. And so if you think about what literary criticism does, the first thing it tries to do is appreciate the narrative without as innocently as possible. We're not that innocent, but we do our best. And then the second piece of that is to say, okay, now let's critique the narrative in terms of its value, its credibility, its applicability, whatever it is. You can do that, obviously. When I was first teaching, we did that in seminars, right? We'd say, well, let's read Moby Dick. What does Moby Dick have to do with being, a teenager in Olivet, Michigan? So we would talk about that. In the marketing world, it's more about, first of all, obviously, marketing messaging is clearly based on narratives. Think about Steve Jobs and Apple and the 1984 narrative that kicked off the Macintosh, that kind of stuff. So there's always narratives there. But also, investment is about narratives. So why would you put money into this startup? It's all about narrative because at the early stage investing, there's no history. It's just a story and a bunch of storytellers. And so you interrogate the credibility of their backgrounds and their story, and you pressure test it. So that's what's going on there. And then when it came to writing The Infinite Staircase, it was about how would you create there's been so much learned about the way in which the universe emerged in the secular version of how the universe emerged, but it was all in bits and pieces. How would you pull together the narrative? And so that I really wanted to do that. And that was the first 2/3 of the book, was just how could you build the story from the Big Bang to Boaz and Brian and Geoffrey talking on this podcast? How would you get from A to B? And if that narrative held up, the other question you ask about narratives, because they all imply strategies for living, they all embody strategies, is, well, what strategies for living would make most sense given the narrative that we just went through? So that was kind of where it all came from.
I think I watched a lecture that you gave, or a little talk that you gave to some Colombian students that were maybe humanities students. And, as Boaz said, your last book is about philosophy, but I would argue that all your books are about philosophy. And interestingly, you started with language. And then at the end of your latest book, we end up again with a kind of an appreciation of the leverage of language, as you were saying with narrative. And when I started looking at your work, because I'm not an entrepreneur per se, I've run little businesses, and so I understand some of that. But what I saw and what I see through is metaphor. And it seems to me that if language was a tool set, metaphor would be like one of the biggest wrenches that we would have. on the tool bench. And I remember you talking a little bit about metaphor as like a tool for understanding what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about metaphor, it's the most creative, it's the most innovative thing we can do with language. Because basically, what a metaphor, one way to think about a metaphor, is to say, look, there's a complicated situation over here. We're trying to figure it out. There's a known situation over there that we understand the principles of how it operates. If I tell you that this situation is like that situation, I'm inviting you to take the strategies that work in the known situation and test them out in the unknown situation to see if they account accurately for what's going on. And of course, great metaphors do that. And we talked about the metaphor, like the metaphor of DNA coding for making proteins. Well, DNA has no brain and it cannot code, right? But the fact of the matter is, it does create these three amino acids together that create something called a codon, which works a lot like a byte in a computer language, and you can build a code around it. And so you couldn't understand what DNA was doing. And in fact, nobody understood what DNA was doing until in the last 50 years. But once they put the coding metaphor, then they understand, oh, there's a ribosome that builds proteins based on the codes for coming from the DNA. And there's this incredible amount of work that goes into this because it's not the DNA, it's transfer RNA. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on and on as to how these incredible things people have come up with. But you couldn't have even started that journey without the idea of coding. And so that's an example of a meta. Sometimes we call it a root metaphor. And a root metaphor is one that is so strong it kind of organizes everything. Like the staircase, the infinite staircase for me is the root metaphor of that book. Just like the technology adoption life cycle is the root metaphor for crossing the chasm. I mean, there's that sense that metaphor can create coherence and order in a very large scale.
And it's sort of built on maybe an instinct that as we're going through experience, we say, wait, I think I've seen this before somehow. And and I'm relating back to that prior experience, bringing it forward, which is, of course, that hermeneutical idea. So again, language, and it isn't just the language, it's the linguisticality of reality somehow. It's this idea that we're discovering how things work, not just this thing, which is like the philosophical undertaking, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, if you one of the stairs in the staircase before it actually got to metaphor at the end of it, but was language itself. And I wanted to make the claim that although there are 6,000 languages on the planet and they're all grammatically very different, and whatever, that there are only really five functions that all 6,000 language perform, and they're related to strategy, and therefore they're related to figuring out how the world works. So there's the naming function. It's mostly nouns and noun-like things, but we're naming bodies of forces. So whatever we have a noun for, the reason we have a noun for that thing is because there's some force associated with that thing that relates to somehow how you live in the world, whether it's a tree or an iPhone or a glass of water or a car, whatever it is, or your spouse, all good things. The forces in the world, and then the verbs are how the forces interact with each other, how they behave. They either describe the state you're in or they describe some force that's going to change the state to some other state. But verbs and nouns work together to talk about how forces play out in the world. That's the second category. And all 6,000 languages have verbs, and all 6,000 languages have nouns. Modifiers just help you get a better view of both of them. So, more specific verbs, more specific nouns. And then conjunctions are the fourth category, and that's what sticks them together. So whether it's and this or but that or when this or because of that or in the event that, I mean, it's all that stuff of sticking stuff together so you can build larger and larger scenarios for what's going on. And then the final thing I said is just the claim that when you pull these things together in a sentence, what you're doing is you're making a claim about the world. And part of the purpose of any criticism, whether it's literary criticism or just practical criticism, natural language criticism, is just to say how verifiable is that claim, and how real, how valuable is that claim.
Right. Now, for me, that's a very American way to go about it. Because the continental philosophers, they kind of would drift off. And it was really the Americans that said, let's look at outcomes. And, that's why, because as you mentioned, language, it's really like mind reaching out into the world to try to work with it. And what I see you've done in your work is you've sort of aided people in that process by sort of troubleshooting. Like we all like one that I love. I did run a business, and so I had customers. And in anyone in any business makes distinctions about customers. And some of those distinctions are powerful and some of them aren't. And they show up sometimes as, oh, that guy, he's a pain in the ass. Or those people, they want a lot out, but they always want to take more than they get, right?
Mhm.
So not all distinctions are useful. And it seems that in your work, you have managed to not only identify the distinctions that bring home the bacon in terms of outcomes, but you've also set them in a framework. Because, for example, everybody knows people are different. Everybody knows that enterprises go through life cycles, but you've put those in a way, in a framework that lets people work with them because they knew that, but they weren't getting the results, the outcomes that your structure of thought has provided for them. So to me, that's just complete philosophy. That's
Okay.
a philosophical machine.
Yeah, well, and that, by the way, that is my life's work. So if I had to say, if I took the word framework, that would be like, yeah, on his tombstone, frameworks for Geoffrey. I mean, because that's and the purpose of a framework is to do two things. First of all, it too is a claim. So there's not like the framework is like there's no God's truth. We don't have any stone tablets. It's a claim, a set of claims. But the idea is to empower another person to say, if you just try on this pair of glasses. Is it clearer, darker, or sharper when you take them on or put them off? And the framework's intended to say, okay, try it out, and if you like it, then let's continue to work with the framework. So there's a handful of frameworks that I've been working with for 40, 50 years, and I'm pretty good at them. But and some and they resonate with a bunch of people, but not everybody. And so the people that it resonates with, you go forward with, and the people that don't, you say, you know, good luck finding whatever framework works for you. Yeah.
Right. And those frameworks are kind of work like metaphors. And I suspect that in your consultation business, you use that metaphorical process for problem solving. You
All the
sort
time.
of say, oh, I feel in this individual, unique, one off situation, I feel this pattern that I recognize. And so here's the framework they're missing, or here's the special sauce that's actually going to make these pieces relate correctly.
It's pattern recognition. It's probably I'm not a chess player, but I imagine the good chess players, these people that can play like 64 games of chess all at the same time. So they walk up to a board and they go, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And I think when you work with frameworks, a lot of times it's like, so I have this zone framework I've been working with a lot now with big companies where they have a performance zone and a productivity zone and an incubation zone and a transformation zone. And again, Brian, it's just what you said. There's nothing we say during those conversations that they didn't actually know, but they weren't making it actionable. They were getting trapped. And what the framework tries to do is to show you, look, there's some principles you cannot violate the core principles that the framework's trying to illustrate. If you do, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And that was true of the technology adoption life cycle, and it's true of the zone to win metaphors, and I think it's arguably true with the infinite staircase metaphors.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to just to orient our listeners, Geoff, would you be kind enough to share a little more about the infinite staircases premise, like what the
Yeah.
especially I'm especially interested in the bridge that you create through being to the human experience. So you're kind of
Yeah.
that's a
Let me,
big.
yeah. Yeah, it's a big deal. Let me do the staircase first a little bit, just to be fair to people that have said, "Well, what the hell staircase?" I mean, the idea behind prior to like 200 years ago, it was unimaginable to look at the world and not assume that there was a divine creator. I mean, how in the world could anything like this possibly exist? Because no human being could even come close to starting. What started happening was they started building an alternative narrative, and the alternative narrative says reality emerges in layers. And if you go all the way back to the Big Bang, The only reality right after the Big Bang was pure physics. There wasn't even chemistry. There was no life. There was just pure physics. And frankly, the mathematics, probably you could only understand it with math, and I'm not a math major. When the universe cools down enough, electrons can bond to protons, and you actually can get atoms, and you can get molecules, and you can start to get chemistry. Now the universe consists only of physics and chemistry. That's it. Then you fast forward a scant 13 billion years or whatever it is. All of a sudden, you have this thing called Earth forming out of a cloud of dust about 4.5 billion years ago. And you get, and the Earth consolidates and it gets water and the sun. We don't quite, there's a whole bunch of ways about how this could have happened. But the point is, biological life emerges on Earth about 4 billion years ago, we think, give or take, whatever. But the point is, it's single cells. So that's a third layer of reality. It includes physics and it includes chemistry. And this is important about the staircase. You never leave a stair behind, but each stair brings a set of phenomena to the table that were just not present before. They just weren't there. And so the first three, physics, chemistry, biology, and that's the realm of materialism, and that's kind of that the natural sciences, everybody gets that. Then what happens is you start getting complex organisms, and there's a whole argument about how this falls. I won't go into that right now, but the point is that you get organisms that have multiple tissues and different organs, and they're sending hormones to each other, and you get this thing called, we call it, I just generalize it as desire, where chemical signals are causing parts of your body to want other things, and so you desire, and that desire creates seeking behavior, feeding behavior, mating behavior, whatever. But no consciousness yet. It's just, in fact, you think about it in a plant. So a plant desires the sun, or it desires water, or it desires, now it doesn't have a brain, but it is acting out of chemical signals that are shaping its behavior dynamically within time. Consciousness emerges somewhere along this line, and consciousness is an incredible aid to desire. And Hume, who was one of the 18th century British philosophers, said, reason has no other business but to be a slave to the passions. And what I translate that to be is consciousness evolved in service to desire. Help you get more food, help you get a better mate, help you protect yourself from that predator, whatever it is. And by the way, let you move. I mean, you couldn't be a mobile animal without consciousness. You could be a stationary plant, but you can't move in the world without a brain. You have to have a brain, if there's something like a brain. So anyway, so that's fifth stair on the staircase. So and then the next two, values and cultures, which historically I've always associated with very high on the staircase. I realized in writing the book, both of those come into existence before humans. Mammals, in particular, have values. It's clear that mammals nurture their young. They protect the tribe. They act in all the ways that we humans think are moral. Even though they don't have a morality or a code, they act and they demonstrate those values. And culture, I decided, was just simply the ability to transmit strategies socially. And again, you see birds doing it, you see chimpanzees doing it, you see animals learning from each other tricks, good tricks, if you will. So the stairs in the middle, which I call the metaphysics of Darwinism, were desire, consciousness, values, and culture. And I said they all came into existence before people. So, and by the way, again, with the staircase, you never leave that behind, which means we're animals before we're people, just like we're chemicals before we're animals, right? Okay, so we're now at the point where the top of the staircase starts with language, which to me is the totally game-changing innovation. That's the one that completely separates humanity from everybody else dramatically. Doesn't mean we've stopped being animals, but there's no animal that comes close to behaving the way humans behave. So we're doing that. And then that led to narrative, and then analytics, which is kind of the criticism that Brian and I were just talking about, the hermeneutics you would apply to a narrative. And then the final one was theory, which was, okay, can you, and that was the thing we were talking about, metaphor. Could you find something that sort of, the one ring that rules them all, sort of the explanation of all explanations. And so the idea behind that was, in doing that, I wasn't trying to say, so you see religion's wrong and this is right. What I was trying to say is you can build a totally coherent, incredibly fascinating, I find totally gobsmackingly miraculous narrative around getting from the Big Bang to Jeff, Boaz, and Brian talking today without having any intelligent agent intervene. Now, that doesn't say you couldn't have had it, but you don't have to have it. And I wanted to build that. And then that gets to, well, that's probably a lot, but as you got to the point of, well, then how do you get from there to ethics?
Right.
And that is an interesting question, because if you say, well, if there's no God, why do we have to be good? Right? I mean, if you think about ethics as traditionally, it's always been derived from some version of a divine responsibility, right? And you say, well, there's no divinity here. Well, whoa. What's going to keep people from murdering each other in the streets or whatever it would be? And so the notion of how to build that connection came out. As I said in the book, as an American, I'm an heir to two traditions: a pragmatist tradition, which is what Brian was just talking about before, this outcomes-oriented American approach, as opposed to a continental, more cerebral, experiential, mystical approach. This was saying, no, let's just deal with outcomes for a while. But that pragmatist approach was leaving me in the lurch when I was trying to authorize ethics. Like, so what if killing people works better than not killing people? Shouldn't we just kill people? Because that's what Darwin said. And so I was trying to figure out how do we get to there. And so being is the other part of the other contribution that America made. It was using Germanic Romanticism, but it really put its own flavor on it. Was Transcendentalism, and Transcendentalism says that there is a field in nature called being, with a capital B, that has the effect of a divine force of energy. It's life supporting, whatever. But again, if I'm being a pragmatist, like, that's not verifiable. I mean, you can't like detect it like the Higgs boson you can detect, but you can't detect this thing. But then I said, but on the other hand, the way the staircase, I make a claim about it, we can't get to the absolute bottom of it, and we can't get to the absolute top. So to say that there couldn't be something outside of the range of what we can investigate isn't to say it couldn't exist. It could, but you can't make claims about it. You just have to realize it's possible. The other thing I claimed was, because as you guys know, I've been practicing transcendental meditation for over 50 years. I just am totally internally convinced that I experience this thing all the time. And so I thought, and by the way, people who do mindfulness and yoga, and there's a lot of people that have spiritual experiences of various kinds, not so much the ones that are like the unrepeatable, oh my God experiences, the conversion experiences. I think much more about the quieter, everyday kind of serenity experiences, but that come out of these various practices. That became a, a psychological grounding point for going to ethics. And that's kind of how we got the bridge from this very secular, non-religious narrative to, because basically the ethics that I am, the Christian ethics. I mean, I didn't invent any new ethics when we get to the ethics part. I anchored them in a different place because I tried to tie them back to the staircase rather than tie them to a religious narrative. But they're the same ethics.
Can I put that in the bigger philosophical picture?
Yeah.
Because this is an old problem. This idea that they usually call it the grounding problem in ethics. And I think it started back with David Hume, with this idea that we can't get from is in that to ought,
Yeah.
right? Because stuff we know about, but where does that ought come from? And so this is you're taking on something that a lot of great minds have banged up against through history. Just a footnote. But the other thing is this idea of the great chain of being is not a new idea, but you've sort of taken it to a different place. So, or maybe it's not a different place, maybe it's an expanded place, because it's like we witnessed certain things and then we made some assumptions based on that. Here's God, for example. But at the same time, and this is sort of relevant to that.
Well, hold on.
You
Just
know,
let me just stop for a second, because you said I want to insert something before we get to the second point.
yeah. Please do.
The great chain of being was created from the top down.
Right.
And the difference between it and the infinite staircase is created from the bottom up. And the problem with creating from the top down is you end up getting a dualistic mindset. At some point, you think, well, there's mind and there's matter, and you have all that dualism that really plagued Western philosophy for a very long time. And it's very hard. You kind of see the staircase building down, and by the time you get to animals, it's like, well, animals can't be very relevant, and after that, it's just matter, and matter is mindless. So there's a lot of, I just found that to be very, very hard to work with. If you take the same staircase, but build it from the bottom up, then it's grounded in a way that just, I think, works better, and particularly you don't leave anything behind,
Right.
which is what I think was important. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can make another point.
Well, what I wanted to point to is exactly in that process. Um, Plato said that the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. And one of the things that we notice is that all philosophers, they'll take some terms and they become what I call the beasts of burden of their philosophy. Those terms get a lot piled onto them. And then they can write these great ponderous books like Being and Time and Truth and Method and all these great, and great works they are in their own
Yeah.
for what they do. But it seems like in that story of building it, we still have this idea of emergence, which becomes, I think, in your model, a bigger term than just what we normally use when we talk about a chicken emerging from the egg
I
or
mean,
something.
I would say the emergence is the core principle behind the staircase, and the emergence, to define terms back to Plato, is to say reality is not constructed as a gradient. It's constructed in separate levels, and at each level, it emerges from the one below it, meaning it is totally dependent on the one below it. You cannot divorce it from the one below it, but it is not determined by the one below it. It has properties that are genuinely novel. And so we have these 11 stairs, maybe there are more stairs or fewer stairs, I don't know, but every stair in that model has genuinely novel properties at each stage that emerge. And that idea that order could emerge is really that's the alternative to intelligent design. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bo.
I was just going to say it's similar to Ken Wilber's idea in Sex Ecology and Spirituality, or the shorter version, I think, was A Brief History of Everything. Are you familiar with that one, Jeff?
No, I don't. I don't know Ken. I think of Bill Bryson doing the brief history of everything, but I don't know Ken.
Yeah. There's that. I think it's a similar name. Yeah.
Okay.
But Wilbur talks about holons, and a holon is something that exists in and of itself, but is also part of a field. So an electron exists in and of itself, but is part of an atom. An atom is in and of itself a thing, but is part of a molecule, etc. And he describes similar properties. I think he's got 22 or 23 tenets that each level has.
Okay.
That do what you're describing. That demonstrate this novel quality at the higher level of function, when it's part of the next level compared to when it's standalone.
And the key thing there is that there's a tendency in the top-down model to think that it's inferior as it gets lower, and that's just a mistake. I mean, it's true that a higher level creates the significance of lower level things. So if you have a contract and there's a misspelled word, that can affect the contract. Or if there's a mutation in your DNA, you can have MLS or MS or whatever. There's a case where the higher thing does is become disabled or in some way by a lower level. So there's a real connection there. But the notion that these layers are inferior or superior is the wrong notion. The better notion is to say every layer has a set of rules. That set of rules predicts or does its best to predict behavior at that layer. And when you're at that layer, you should use that set of rules. But you should not try to export that set of rules either up or down. And the problem with a lot of I would call it moralistic philosophy is they try to export rules down in ways that are just, I think, inappropriate. And so my whole wish, and this is true of all frameworks, the whole purpose of a framework is put it in the right context and then come to terms with it. But most failed actions, not most, but a whole body of failed actions are due to the fact that you put it in the wrong place.
I do think there's a hierarchy of complexity, though, that you're describing.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Each one is more complex than the prior. As
yeah,
you go up the thing, you're increasing in complexity at every level. Yeah.
And as you said, you're not really starting from the bottom. You're just starting from the lower end and moving toward. And we don't really know where the bottom or the top are.
That's absolutely correct. At the very, I mean, we're getting pretty damn small. I mean, but still, to be fair, yeah, there's no absolute bottom that we can observe and no absolute top. So
Now
really,
I've heard this
yeah.
might just be a rumor. I've heard that it's actually turtles all the way down.
Well, yes, yeah. In fact, that's well, the
I think
first time
that's agreed upon by philosophers.
oh, the first time I heard that, it just struck me in the heart. I just love that. Just yeah, turtles all the before you ask, it's turtles all the way down.
Which sort of points out to that philosophical problem that we can get into of an infinite regress,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
we start chasing our own tail, sort of
yeah.
philosophically.
That's why I get cranky about skepticism. I mean, absolute skepticism, because yes, you can play that game, but it's like you're wasting time. I mean, you know that you have a finite amount of time on the planet. Are you sure this is the way you want to play the game? Uh,
Yes.
I think there was a time when it was important because I think there was, I mean, if in a world which has become overly righteous and therefore, frankly, unfair in just all kinds of different ways, skepticism is a good, is a good way of pushing back against it. But as a platform, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Right. Well, and it seemed like it served a purpose in a certain chapter.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
and that, and this was my point about in our pre-meeting, the difference between hermeneutics really and a natural science approach is that at some point our experience as humans brings a richness to things that if we're only thinking ontically as opposed to ontologically, we're going to miss a lot. And I think
Yeah.
you mentioned that in your book.
Well, and I think the place where we start missing it is when we disconnect from animals. So for me, the thing that was shocking to me, or it was a discovery for me in the middle of the staircase, was to realize just how mammalian all of our higher values are. I mean, they're just anchored in mammalian life. And once you do that, then I think that takes a little bit. That says, okay, so I do not want to divorce. I mean, that's also prior to language, right? So it's not just that I inherit physics and chemistry and biology. I inherit values and culture even before I become a human, and that was a surprise to me. But that to me, that's what creates that connectedness, Brian, that you're referring to. That we don't divorce ourselves from the quote lower parts of the chain.
Mhm. Now it seems to me that there isn't. I don't feel a huge break between Staircase and the rest of your work. In some sense, it feels like a logical progression. Because I'm not a business person and because I'm using metaphor to translate, when I looked at a number of the things that you said, I could dress it in a slightly different context and make it all about psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
You, I mean, literally, you're blurring this distinction. You're not listening to the needs of others. What was one phrase I really loved? You're captured in the gravitational field of your own past. It's great. And so that, my feeling, and I said in our pre-meeting that I felt there was a lot of trapped value in your work.
Oh, thank you.
Trapped because it's only in a context of how do I do a business startup,
Mm-hmm.
and not in the context of how do I understand my own thinking and the tricks to my own thinking and the ways that illusions play, or my thrownness. And the thing that I liked about your later chapters in Staircase was that it sort of implies that we have a lot of work to do that's not out in the ethical fields of action, but it's actually in the being who we are as humans in all of those capacities.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I would just say that to that, there's a tendency sometimes to think of ethics as some kind of a rule book or some kind of a code that you have to live up to. I think, first of all, if it comes from animals, there sure as hell is not a rule book because animals can't read. So or write. So the question that is where is it coming from? And does it then get embodied language? Yes. Can you at the time? Is there narratives that create ethical aspirations? Of course there are. That's how we become ethically inspired. And then is there natural language criticism? Can you analyze those narratives for critically? Yes. And in analysis, can you build rules? Yes, you can. But understand that's a very late developing intellectual act, and it's not at the heart of being moral. It's more about stepping back from morality and trying to understand it in some larger systems framework. It's not about being moral. Being moral is much more spontaneous. It's much more visceral. It's I mean, now Kant and other guys said, "Oh no, 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 no! It's no, no, Geoff, you're wrong. There's God. He had the rules. We got the Bible. We read the rules. We play by the rules. That's how you lead an ethical life." I don't buy it.
Mhm. So see, I'm very interested in the idea, do we have an a priori intuition for morality or ethics?
Yeah, and
And
I would say that yes, because we're
as
animals.
mammals.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. A priori, simply, in my view, means just like somebody else thought of it before you did. I really don't think a priori in any other sense means a lot to me. But yeah, you inherited
Uh-huh,
it. You
uh-huh.
yeah, boys. I know you.
Because
Well, boys wanted to say something. I will let him get a word. You and I will never let him get a word in edgewise. So
I
let's.
Oh,
know.
no, no, it's okay. I'm appreciating the conversation. Where I was going was thinking about, you used the word miraculous earlier relative to kind of the formation of the universe and life, and used the word sacred in the book, if I remember correctly. And I'm just really interested in how we relate to ideas like that from a secular point of view.
Yeah, I
Um,
would say I don't think I use the word sacred.
I
Well,
might,
yeah,
maybe I'm misremembering. I
well,
apologize.
sacred, that's okay. Sacred, I think, is part of the vocabulary of someone who takes a narrative and privileges it to be absolutely true. So if you do that, then that narrative has become sacred, and you must not violate it. I mean, because it's absolute truth. But miraculously, you have it absolutely right with the word miracle. In fact, I'm just writing just a blog will come out this week about this, because one of the things I'm doing on my blog is really fun. Somebody wrote a thing called 10 questions atheists have trouble answering, and so I've been just taking one on. But one of them is about, well, how do you explain miracles? And the simple way to say that is, well, atheists really, if it's not verifiable, they will question the credibility of it. So they don't have to explain miracles because they frankly deny miracles at some level. But that made me cranky because I was thinking, yeah, but then then there's all this stuff that's miraculous. They have so the molecular biology of the cell. When you read about that, and believe me, it's mind-boggling. You discover it is the most improbable set of concatenating reactions. I mean, it's like a Rube Goldberg machine would be a simple tic tac toe compared to what happens inside the cell. And so you think, well, how in the world did that happen? How in the world did any of this stuff happen? And to me, that's miraculous. And if I get cranky about religion, is that I think they're substituting a a magical view of miraculous, which I think is falls short of the actual miraculousness. And so I'm just afraid that people are going to miss. That they're going to see something. Oh, this is a miracle, and I got it. Yeah, water from wine, got it. It's a miracle. But it's like, yeah, but have you looked out your window? I mean,
Yeah. Well, that's where I was going, Geoff, is that I thought that a secular experience of the miraculous is essentially wonder. And I wonder if that's related to this a priori intuition that you and Brian are talking about, relative to morality. Like, if we can experience this wonder as something that kind of just arises within us when we witness what we're experiencing, is that part of what guides us about morality and ethics?
I think I think one of the ways to think of wonder, not the only way, is that it is that pre-linguistic reality that we participate in finding its way into our consciousness. And it's typically through, because we live in language. It's tricky because it's hard to have wordless experiences. But that's part of the point of meditation and mindfulness and some of these other things, is to see if we can reconnect without the filter of words. But when you have that experience, it is. I mean, it's wonderful, and wonder is, I think, a form of consciousness it's very, very close. I think it's close to the spiritual experience. It's close to the serene experience. It's hard. It's an incredibly precious gift, and I associated it in the book with joy. And I said that what makes joy different from happiness and pleasure is that the stimulus, the experience is so out of proportion to the stimulus. So the stimulus is something really rather slight or modest or evanescent, and your entire being is just like, whoa. I mean, it just completely takes you over, and so you're thinking, well, how in the world? And I think it's part of this wonder thing. It's part of that same field of experience that I think does underlie moral. It's not that you don't apply conscious and language to moral decisions, because we do, but I don't think you start there. I think I don't. Yeah.
So that brings up for me a couple related ideas. Aristotle's idea of morality. It isn't just do this and don't do this. It was one that we actually kind of strive through our lives to attain. And Confucius had the same idea. We want to be chunsu. We want to be gets translated as the superior
Superior
man.
man. Yeah, yeah.
But it's like over our lifetime we accumulate and we build this. And because you and I are both longer in the tooth than our younger companion here.
That child that we're talking with, you're
This
quite right. Yeah.
child we're
Yes,
talking
yes, yes, yes.
um, we have some breadth of a dimension from the view
Yeah,
that sort of contextualizes things. And so my questions are: there's two sides to it. One is, what do you think about that and
yeah,
our moral career, as it were?
yeah.
But also, because we have that same bigger sample size, what do you think about the world since you and I were watching Lucas McCain
It's okay.
and
All right.
Sergeant
On the
and
rifle gun.
Sergeant Saunders? See, youngster Boaz here, he doesn't know
He
any of
doesn't even
these
know where these
guys.
people are. Okay, okay. Oh
But
God.
you and I both know that if we were going through something, we would want Lucas McCain at our side, right? Fair to
Absolutely,
say?
absolutely, absolutely. Oh gosh. Well, there's so much that, but a bunch of that stuff. So back to Aristotle first. So Aristotle had this vision of anything wanted to fulfill its function. I mean, a tree wanted to become an oak, acorn wanted to become an oak, and they had the same sense of a human being. A human being wants to become virtue is becoming your fulfilled self. We would probably call it self-realization in contemporary psychology. But the other piece of that is socialization. So it's not just us. I mean, the thing I get a little cranky about the existentialists was because they had such a horrible social experience with the war, they tended to discount social as a force of goodness. And they went back inside themselves and said, you're thrown into the world. The world's a heartless place. You got to make it on your own, buddy. And in their world, that probably was pretty damn close. But that's not my experience of the world. And so I think there's a piece of it when you think about the Aristotelian view. There's a part that says, I want to be like Lucas McCain. I want to be like Luke Skywalker. I want to be like Harry Potter or Holden Caulfield or Elizabeth Bennet or whoever I'm going to be like. And that's a narrative. By the way, we're playing a character in a narrative. That's the self as a character in a narrative. But those narratives came from the culture, right? We didn't invent those narratives. We were gifted with those narratives, and we select among them, and we like some and we don't like others. So, and then I think the other piece of that is we critique the narratives and we say, well, is that just escape fantasy, or is that something? Is that a real strategy for living, or is that just a fantasy that in real life could never really work? And so I think that's part of what we're doing. But to your point about the long view, I think as we carry those role models forward with us, and we find new role models. But I would say that my life was determined by role models that I knew, all the role models I knew before I was 20. I mean, I am now. I'm living out that heritage, but I'm totally loyal to those earlier. Seventh and eighth grade teachers. I had my parents. I had a handful of literary experiences. And periodically, will I read a new one? Yeah, but after a certain point, it's like, yeah, but that's not me. I mean, I might wish it could be me, but it's not me. And so that's where part of the continuity continues. Yeah.
Yeah. Although in fairness, it's not entirely random, right? Those narratives. Like
No, no.
there's definitely something, another emergence, if you will, through culture as a filter, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. I mean, but the point is, look, as parents, you select the narratives you expose your children to, right? And society does the same thing. Now, by the way, you can get caught up in a undercurrent, which actually puts you into a counter society. But that's a society too, right? It's just a different society. And there's some dark societies that are pretty damn dark, and they're a pretty bleak place to get. But a lot of people they aggregate people to get there, so that's part of the world. I think if you feel really privileged and blessed, and I think the three of us have been, we were raised in situations which got us involved with essentially healthy narratives. And not to say that we aren't crazy, but the point is that we were gifted with enough good stuff to work with that we can build a life that has a good shot of being fulfilling and useful to others as well as to ourselves. That
And they've stood the test of time through the lives and our moral dilemmas that we might have had to face.
Yes, and by the way, the narratives have stood the test of time. So Shakespeare's narratives are still playing, and there's a bunch of other narratives that are not. So I think there is a form of cultural criticism that just the culture carries forward some number of its strategies for living, and sort of offers them as wares in a marketplace to the next generation, and the next generation picks and chooses and repudiates some, and it's just a new world.
That makes me curious. This is a different direction, Geoff, but I have three kids in their 20s, and I'm starting to see, employees in some of the companies that I work with, even a little younger than that. And it seems to me that how a lot of people, younger people, are exposed to narratives is very different from how we were. Brian and I did an episode about reading and the importance of books in our lives a few weeks ago, and it came up that kids these days, many of them really aren't reading, and they're bombarded with memes, and sound bites, so they are getting a very complex cultural download. But what do you see about how the role of narrative is changing in the world, or the nature of the narratives that are present? How are those changing?
Well, I think you made a point about reading, and I think media, the medium by which you experience a narrative, is actually more profoundly influential than I would originally have imagined. So when I was growing up, it was, well, the movie is never as good as the book. That was a frequent, you kind of heard people say things like that because they were such different mediums. With a book, you can put it down, you can pick it back up, you can fall asleep reading it, you can come back. I mean, there's a sense of lots of space in a video or a film or a play or anything like that. You can't stop time. You go from. I mean, you can pause the video, I guess, but that's about it. So and then when I went to a live play, that was a third experience because I thought the audience reaction, and that was like, oh my goodness, now we fast forward past COVID, and we took a whole lot of the social experience away from media, became very much more, screens. And then the other thing we did with social media is because there was no accountability, there was no editing to speak of, despite what the president says, of that, that you just get exposed to all these different narratives. And I make the point in the book that a narrative has two properties. It can speak some kind of truth that would be useful to absorb, and it can also be a really cool narrative that's fun to tell. And the problem is those are viral narratives, and the problem is some of the viral narratives are not life supporting; they're actually life negating or life destroying. And I think the hardest part and the thing I think most parents are worried about now, particularly with kids maybe like 10 years or 15 years younger than yours, Boaz, is when you're early on, you're innocent about narratives. You just suck the narrative in, and you can easily get dissuaded by a narrative. And you have these people that shoot people because they became radicalized on through social media. So they're very compelling narratives, and so I don't think our society right now has a handle on how to do that. I mean, I think the correct handle is to vaccinate through critical thinking, but that takes a while and it takes a commitment. And by the way, some of the teachers are caught up in the narratives that, frankly, I would want to vaccinate against. So it's not an easy problem.
And we might be compounding the problem with the advent of AI, and technology in general kind of continuing at its pace, even as core narratives become less available or less accessible.
Well, and also we figured out early on that you could that you by following your signals, I can find out which narratives you prefer, and I'll start feeding you more and more narratives to amplify whatever narrative you're on, which is not healthy. That's like going to a single food diet, right? And we're not out of that loop yet. That is a very dangerous. And then if you put AI in charge of it, you just threw gasoline on that fire. Yeah,
Well,
it's
in one
what?
of our previous episodes, I made the observation that it seems like rhetoric has made great advances in dialectic, which, according to Plato, he hated rhetoricians, right? Those sophists, those sophists, right?
Yep.
It's like, well, darn the luck, the sophists are still with us,
Oh,
aren't
you're
they?
kidding? Their score. If you did a score between Plato and the Sophists right now, the Sophists are winning pretty handily. And I mean, particularly if you look at our political sphere, well, our political sphere right now is kind of embarrassing. At the level of sophistry, I guess would be the nicest term you could use to getting there. But that's the point. The narratives have these two attributes. They have this natural selection. In Darwinism, it would be natural selection and sexual selection. So there's the am I good? Am I good at being whatever I am? So I survive and I reproduce, and I survive. That's natural selection. Sexual selection is, can I get a mate and can I turn around? Can we get to the next thing? And so you can imagine, and if I related that to venture capital, a entrepreneur who can run a good business would be natural selection, but an entrepreneur who can get funded is actually sexual selection. And we had many entrepreneurs who were incredibly good at getting funded, but could not build a business. So in other words, and I've also had entrepreneurs who were incredibly good at building a business, but couldn't raise money. And so it's an interesting, you need the intersection of the two.
And that was one of the things that I thought was really worth expanding about your work. Because when I was exposed to Crossing the Chasm, I recognized it as an artist,
Yeah.
as as having an image, and now I have the challenge to make this image live in the world with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I'm making a piece of furniture, I don't just need to make the chair. Now I actually have to make the wood shop that I need to make the chair. And if I really want to do the wood shop, I need to have the business that supports the wood shop that supports the chair. And so all of this is like creation and then meta creation and then meta creation, and that's what your formula really is about, is crossing the chasm.
Yeah.
And in the biggest sense, isn't that what we're always, all of us, trying to do in life? We're
And
trying to take this mind thing and we're trying to make it live in the world,
yes,
right?
and to live in the world, it has to recruit allies in the world, and so it has to be. It's an ecology. Nothing exists in the world without some kind of ecosystem building around it, and it co-ops the ecosystem. The ecosystem co-ops it. So your chair, and then your workshop, and then your business support the workshop. Yeah, I think we're always doing that. And the crossing the chasm piece was, so what happens after a while is we get into a set of routines and a set of established relationships that have inertial momentum. And so you can go on quite a while actually without innovating. You just sort of say, well, I showed up at my job again. I didn't get fired. I got promoted, in fact, last year, and I hope to get promoted 2 years from now. Okay, so it's going along. What the technology adoption life cycle and the chasm was about is, what happens if you disrupt that? Like, what happens, for example, if the entire industry you're in goes out of business, or AI takes away the job that you do, or whatever? Now you've got to kind of restart the engine with a new premise. But and when you do that, what the model says is, you'll always be able to find some people who believe in you and believe what you're doing, and so you can start it with people that are supportive. But to get it to scale, you've got to essentially enlist people that are skeptical. And so crossing the chasm was about, how could you get a larger group of people interested in the same idea? And you can't do it by telling you how wonderful it is and how much you believe in it, how much, because that's not who they are. But what you can do, and what crossing the chasm was all about, was saying, well, if they have a problem that they can't solve today and it's deteriorating, And whatever it is that you're advocating for would actually be the solution, it could be the solution to that problem. Now you can get an anchor with people who are essentially willing to entertain your idea, but only if it's useful to them. And so it's a weird thing because you start in the early market, it's really all about you. It's all about the technology. It's all about it's kumbaya. But when you cross the chasm, it's not about you. It's about them. And then could you be of service to them in their terms, not your terms? And that, for a lot of entrepreneurs, that's really a hard journey to take.
Because you've moved from the first person to the second person.
Exactly. It's I from I to thou, Mr. Boober. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Which is actually, again, translating this as in the general philosophical sphere, or even in the psychological, psychotherapeutic
Yeah.
realm.
Yeah.
This is not insignificant. This is really, I think this was one of the things we talked with another professor from St. John's, who was into the work of Emmanuel Levinas.
I don't know the
Levinas was a student of Heidegger,
Okay.
who was also in a German prison camp.
Hmm.
So he's coming out of all of that, and his deal really is ethics.
Okay.
And it's about encountering the other. Of course, he wrote in French, of course, l'autre. No one wants to make it easy.
Well,
Right.
remember, we used to have a phrase called lingua franca because, in fact, in my mother's generation, French was the international language, not English. Yeah, I took French from the 3rd grade to the 11th grade. Yeah, but anyway, you're back to Levinas and the Heidegger.
Well, his point was it really was about encountering the other.
Yeah.
And sort of putting yourself aside, that bracketing idea from phenomenology.
Yeah.
Putting yourself aside so you can actually reach out and create what he calls a fusion of, or not Levinas, this is Gadamer now, a
Okay.
fusion of horizons.
Okay.
And we build that through language, through that narrative, through sharing a narrative. And it seems like that's very relevant to exactly what you're doing there, which is just, it's totally philosophy.
Yeah, the thing that the distance I have with some of that is that it feels like it's happening in the head before it's happening in the heart. And
Absolutely right. Absolutely
and I
right.
feel like that's I think you want to start with the heart first, and so that's why I get back to the animal mammal stuff that like we say encounter the other, but if you think about a baby growing up, the first being that the baby encounters is their mother or their maternal caregiver, and that relationship is totally supportive. I mean, babies get unconditional love or they die. So
Foundational.
yeah, so there's zero. So the core experience, if you start with the very beginning of your psychological experience, it starts with unconditional love. So to then describe an adult version of reality that has no place for unconditional love, that just
Right.
I think it's just a mistake.
I might even argue that there is no you there until it's encountered by the mother's consciousness,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and this is a great time for me to say, kind of dovetails into the conversation of technology. I read your book, but I also went and I saw a lot of the lectures that you'd given and the interviews that you'd given. And what I got, because, at first I thought, okay, here's this guy, he's a business consultant, he's written some books, got to be a lot of these guys out there, right? But then I listened to some lectures with you and I said, wait a minute, you know what? And curiously, it wasn't necessarily the most professional, but what I got was that you had a certain patience. And then when I saw that patience, I said, I think that might be compassion there that's resting behind that patience. That's actually what's the dance behind the interaction with this interviewer. And because, again, back to Aristotle, he said, we can't just educate our mind, we have to educate our hearts. And pretty smart guy for the BC, right? And 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 I thought, I know that we're going to find a place to talk about this because this seems like someone who's been educated in the heart as well as the mind.
You
And
know
so
what?
that, because
Yeah,
obviously your mind is very sharp,
yeah.
but there's
A lot of
smart
sharp
people are a dime a dozen, right? We both know that. So I got that there was something there, and I wouldn't necessarily have gotten it the same way from your book, because the book is kind of rhetoric,
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to remark
Thank you.
that.
It's I was saying that I'm accumulation of narratives. So between my parents and then these two teachers I had in the seventh and eighth grade, one of whom was actually my first cousin, but I somewhere along the line I just absorbed an ethic of being in service to others. And if I had to just if that's sort of like the motto, that's like I know if I'm being in service to others in authentic ways, that's what I'm supposed to do, which is why I can't retire. It's not going to stop. But the point about that is that patience or whatever. And by the way, you have to be intellectually curious because sometimes others are boring people, right? But you know what? So are you. But you have to be willing to do that. But if you are, it's delightful. It's also you always learn something, and so that's kind of cool. But I think it's the keel that says, and there's meaning and purpose. One of the questions that the atheist thing was, how do you find meaning and purpose in a world that has no God? And my answer would be by acting out your animal nature, by being in service to others, with both conditional love and unconditional love. I mean, unconditional love without conditional love is a mess. I mean, but either one without the others, that doesn't work. You need both. But anyway, being in service to others, that's why I think maybe we're hearing in some of those interviews of just like, okay, what are you trying? What is this? Yeah, go ahead, Boaz.
Well, and you have a generosity of spirit too, Geoff, that I think is exemplified by you joining us today. We
Oh,
know.
I can send you a big bill. Oh, don't worry. You don't have to pay it, but
but I wanted to ask Geoff. Brian's pointed out a couple of times a connection, a thread through your work relating to business consulting, philosophy, ethics. How do you see philosophy and ethics playing in organizations? What do organizations need today? And part of where I'm coming from is, I see them needing to deal with more complexity in every way, right? The kind of complexity in the fragmentation of narrative that we were talking about earlier, complexity in the economic environment, you name it. How do businesses need philosophy, and how do we get it to them?
yeah, I think if we call it philosophy, they'll think, well, that's too abstract. But the truth of the matter is, it's not. For me, I was talking about that four zone model from Zone to Win. The way in which I introduce that in most conversations is I'll start with what I call their performance zone, which I will say that's where you deliver your value to the world. And that's where you act out your mission. And what I'm trying to get to early on is if you have to be in service to a mission, and the certain mission has to be in service to the world, or the world's not going to buy your stuff. So what is that role? That if you look at the current generation of younger people coming into the business, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for mission, they're looking for values, and if a company says, well, that's not my job, our job is to make computers and sell them and give money to our shareholders, that doesn't work. It's not enough. And so I think so. The words that I think do come in. I think you can use the word mission to introduce it into the business conversation. I think you can use the word values to bring it into to the business conversation. And then I think customer success is another one because customer success implies you're being in service to your customer. But we gotta connect with that energy. That's the life energy that was given to us, and we're supposed to give pass along. And if you don't connect to that, well, particularly in this digitally remote world, you'll have disengaged employees and you'll have disengaged customers, and you'll kind of drift along, and it's not serving anybody. What's really cool about being in Silicon Valley is there's always been this passion about we want to create technology that changes the world, and sometimes that passion has gotten out of control. It's not all been good, but the fact is that's engaged. There's an enormous amount of engagement, and I think that engagement is critical. And I would just say most businesses aren't going to be that technologically innovative, so it's not like you can't copy the Silicon Valley model. it's really kind of a corner case almost. But you can be in service to your customers. And one of the things I try to warn companies that get into trouble is most companies get into trouble because they've over rotated to being in service to their investors and they've under rotated to the other constituencies, their customers, their employees, their communities, their partners, their ecosystems. And so it's like, and I make this point over and over again, investors don't care about your company. To an investor, your company is a financial instrument. And by the way, that's exactly correct. That's exactly how they should think about your company. But that means you cannot think of them as your number one constituency because they can't be. Now, back in the day when you needed a lot of money to make particularly a manufacturing company, the investor had a lot more to say. But today with digital businesses and service businesses, investors are important, but they're not that important. Customers and employees are much more important, and increasingly communities are more important. And so I think getting people to reorient and business schools, they give lip service to that, but they really haven't nailed it. Back to Brian's point, business schools need to become more psychological, more ethical, more whatever. Not to preach ethics, but to integrate that energy into the business model and into the operating model, as opposed to saying, well, we've done total shareholder returns and we've also done we get rid of the bottom 10% and there's a bunch of stuff that they teach in business schools that are tactics that are not stupid but left to their own devices, they're heartless and soulless, and it's not good.
My experience of investors, unfortunately, is not that businesses have over rotated towards the investors' interests. Rather, investors have tremendous power and use it to maximize their return to the detriment of the organization, the customer, the other constituents that you named. I'm thinking of private equity in particular.
I think that's failed management. In other words, yes, I think when management capitulates to investors do exactly what you said. But I'm not blaming the investor. I'm blaming management.
Say more.
Well, in other words, it's management's job to find the capital to run the business, but you have to select it from people that are going to play by your rules, not by. And I think what happens is people are very naive about the various agendas of investors. So you have to be thoughtful about how you do that. And by the way, the sooner you can create your own capital through your own operating income, so that you can become a self-sustaining, the better. And like when Brian was, I do my business. I've never had an investor in my business, Brian. I don't know if you had an investor in your business, but it's like no, you kind of you start with a service business. Can I wash your car? And you build from there, and eventually you can create product. And so I think investing. I think no capital. If you're manufacturing, you need capital investment. If you're going to scale any business, you need capital investment. And so but I think you have to be careful about your narrative and you have to understand the investor's narrative. And because you bring these people on your board of directors, and a single bad board of director can tank a company, and many of them have, and that is bad. And you are vulnerable because you don't know if you're a CEO and you want money and they offer you money. It's like, well, what's the bad part? And you don't find out what the bad part is until maybe it's a bit late.
So, as a related question, we have this relationship between morality and ethics, and then that sort of comes to live within a company. And we talked about a story in past episodes where a guy was sent to interrogate a prisoner, and if he lied to the prisoner, he would maybe get the information that he wanted, but the prisoner was going to get shot either way. And he found that he was in the grip. He couldn't lie to the guy, and they didn't get the information that they wanted. But one of the comments from management was, I guess he wasn't the right guy for the job. So my question is, this was from the 40s, and it seems like in those days ethics only lived in the C-suite. But now we're in this time. I know you've talked about the role of collaboration. And I personally read history and say that the role of the individual is sort of becoming more and more enhanced, and therefore the responsibility. So the individual's morality needs to relate to the company's ethics in a way that's more direct, maybe, than in past days. Can you speak to that, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was one of the books. So I wrote a bunch of business books. The two I'm really committed to are the first and the last ones. But one in the middle, I hitchhiked a culture model from a guy named Bill. I'm going to say it's Schneider, but it's not Schneider. Anyway, he had these four cultures, and he called them the creativity culture, the collaboration culture, the competition culture, and the control culture. And you could sort of see businesses in different industries and in different states of maturity would naturally gravitate to one of the others of those things. So that claim you made about the guy that said, you weren't the right guy for the job, whatever, that's a competition culture. It's a competition culture that says, look, just win, baby. That's the only ethics is just win. The creativity culture is a very individualistic culture. It's sort of the startup-y, self-realization kind of thing, and think different, and be your best self and all that kind of stuff. It's really great for starting things. It probably doesn't scale at some point. It just doesn't scale very well. What's interesting about my world is my dad grew up in a hierarchical control culture world where bureaucratic controls is how you scale things around the world. And then I would argue in the '90s, actually, in the '90s in tech, competition cultures, Intel, Microsoft, Sun, these are all the Silicon Valley ideas. They kind of ran the table. Oracle, I mean, they were really very, very competitive and not particularly nice. I think what's interesting about the last 15 years is that collaboration cultures are now winning. So the CEO of Microsoft now, Satya Nadella, is a collaboration culture leader. Bill Gates was not a collaboration culture leader. Neither was Steve. Neither was Steve Ballmer. Okay, so it's interesting to watch that happen. Mark Benioff is a strong collaboration culture leader. It's not everybody is, but it's really interesting to watch. And so I think that the young people right now are expecting. In fact, young people are a little bit naive. They believe that they should be entitled to control the entire philosophy of the organization. It's like, well, you might want to just hold on it for a second, but they feel entitled. Well, that's possibly, I would say, a weakness, and a collaboration culture still has to have accountability. It still has to have discipline. But I think that and the reason why is because collaboration culture is so powerful. At least in the technical world, it's obvious to see that with all the what they call APIs, all the ways that software connects to other software connects to other software, you create these very, very large webs of capability, but they have to be managed mutually. You can't dictate that. There's no single sense of point of control. So there's a sense of continually ongoing ecological adaptation, and that's a leadership style. You have to be able to play that game. But that is the winning game right now, at least as far as I can tell. I think it's so. And by the way, it's also my. I think also what happens is I like collaboration cultures and they like me. Competition cultures are very suspicious of me, and rightfully so. And so I tend not to work as much in competition cultures.
I might even make the argument that a collaboration culture needs more accountability
Yeah.
than normal operating
Yes.
procedures.
Yes. In fact, the sad thing, I mean, you look at the progressive movements in, say, San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, where the cities really have suffered dramatically from governments that were very empathetic with marginalized constituencies, but lost any sense of accountability to the majority, and eventually lost their mandate because eventually people said, well, no. And so I do think that building accountability and empathy, getting accountability and empathy together, because they're a very powerful combination, but either one by itself is not. It's really important to get them together, and that's not that common. You know,
Right. Well, that's almost a philosophical anarchist opinion that to the degree that we have an internalized master,
yep.
we don't need an externalized one. But if we can't internalize that accountability, then there's only going to be hell to pay, literally, in one form or the other. So then we better get an external master to just keep the survival of the species.
Which, by the way, is what we elected in the United States. A whole bunch of people took exactly that thought process and said, therefore, we're going to vote for that guy. And he is external, and he's well. Anyway,
Well, I have a related question to that, and that is, you've related to the life cycle of a business has definite stages, definite chapters. And in those chapters, the thinking that works in one chapter not only doesn't work so well in the next, it might be exactly wrong. Do you see a chaptery kind of thing going on with the cultural, again, back to our aged condition of having seen a big part of the pattern? Do you think we're, because I was, if you want to really get friends at a cocktail party, ask people, do you really think if it matters who wins the election?
And by the way, for some people, maybe the answer is no.
Well, well, my question was, are we in a chapter
Yeah,
thing? And
yeah,
are we trying to vote our way out of a chapter? Like, I'd love to vote my way out of old age,
yeah.
but I know there's an inevitability because of the life cycle, you
Well,
know?
if you just take our cohort, so the '60s was a hugely influential time in my life. But let
Me
me go
too.
back to the '50s. The '50s was a hugely influential thing because I was a nebbishy, nerdy guy, and there was no place in the '50s for a role model. You either were a surfer boy or you were a cool guy or whatever. I was none of the above. The '60s came along, and God bless, I don't know why, some nebbishy people became kind of popular for a while. And so I had this opportunity to sort of thrive. But it was also a time of idealism. I mean, we were protesting the war in Vietnam. There was a whole youth movement that was, you know, it was it was very, very active. It wasn't as self-righteous as some of the movements are today, but it was definitely wanted to engage, and so that was great. Then you have the '70s, '80s, '90s. So I think there are these cultural things that happen. I remember the late '70s or early '80s being very self-centric, very kind of hedonistic, kind of. That, I remember that kind of period. Um, the thing that's interesting to me about today is we made a very serious mistake in America's politics, and we're not even close to having understood how serious that mistake is. But that's what we're living with, and I think the game is that's And by the way, that in part is due to the prior administration not fulfilling enough of the majority's needs to be able to retain its position. So we're in the middle of something that's, I think, very, very challenging, and we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, this is and we don't have a playbook for the current. I mean, all our playbooks were based on things like rule of law, like if a judge tells you to do something, you do it. I mean, so
Right.
as I said, we're at the very beginning of this interaction, and hopefully we'll become a better nation because of it. But we'll see.
I wanted to go back to the staircase, Geoff, if you would. Your last chapter of the book is about mortality. And I think we've touched on that a little bit here, but I'd love to hear more from you about why that's where you ended up and what is the context that provides for you.
Well, it's interesting because when I was one thing the 10 questions that atheists have trouble answering. At one point, I wanted to make the point that immortality this plays the same role in a religious narrative that mortality plays in a secular narrative, or the other way around. Mortality is the grounding area, is the grounding for secular narratives, similar to immortality being the grounding for religious narratives. Which means that, look, you need to start with the fact that we're playing a limited engagement here. So what's the point? And yet at the same point, we're filled with a life force that we're just like, I mean, we're compelled to live. I mean, obviously, cells are compelled to live. They do all that, but we're compelled to live. Now, that doesn't mean we can't commit suicide, but it's really hard because we're in this game. So then the question becomes, how would you conduct your life? And I made the claim in the Being Mortal book that there's Being Mortal Part One and Being Mortal Part Two. And initially, I said, early on in life, you're too young to be mortal. I mean, you just do what you're doing. And I made the claim that even you can even get up to I gave myself till 50 because I figured that was half time. I said even before look, there's enough on your plate. You don't worry too much about being mortal. But somewhere around you realize you pass the 50, you go, okay, I'm playing in the second half. So this is now the second half of the game. So is there any and I think it got me involved with legacy and impact. Those were two words that kept them coming back to me. So okay, so you want, and by the way, because I feel like those role models that I live with, they gave me a legacy. I feel totally gifted by that. I think, damn it, Geoffrey, pass it on.
Absolutely.
Don't be a dick.
Absolutely.
And so mortality, and what mortality does at some points, it says, okay, clock's ticking. This is, you're not playing a more limited engagement. Are you doing the things that are most important for you to do in the time that you have? And I made the claim that this is why I did Being Mortal Part One and Part Two. Part Two came from a book called Being Mortal by a guy named Atul Gawande, which was about how do you extend hospice to a longer, more constructive socially thing, which is great. That was fun. But I wanted to talk about no, Brian and you and I mean, well, Brian, you're too young, but Brian and I, we're still as good as we're going to be. So it's not like we can't be powerful, but we need to focus it enough that we have the maximum impact. So in my business consulting, I'm always talking about you want to serve a market that's big enough to matter, but small enough to lead, and a good fit with your crown jewels. That's sort of like a mantra in our business consulting. Well, same deal. You want to serve a constituency that is big enough to matter, small enough that you can have real impact, and a good fit with your crown jewels. And so what? And then the question is, how much of your time are you willing to give in service to that, as opposed to just kind of trundling along, keeping the lights on and keeping things going? And the answer is not. You don't want to do 100%. We don't need to be Sister Teresa, but you don't want to get to the end and going, damn it, there's a lot of I could have done a lot more. I could have done a lot more. And so that's the challenge. So Being Mortal for me, part one was all about how could you construct a life plan which gave you the maximum impact to have as much as you can afford. So that's why it was important to have fish to pond ratio, we call it. Pick a pond that's small enough that you can be a big fish, not a puddle, come on, but not an ocean. So because if you think about the people that want to like world peace or eliminate hunger, or it's like, come on, you're one of 9 billion people. You're not that powerful. So focus it down to a place where you can be powerful, but then be powerful. And it's interesting when I say that to young people are still a little bit afraid of the word powerful. Like they think it might be a bad thing. And my point is, damn it, if you're going to do good, you damn well better be powerful. What's the point of being good if you're not being powerful? Now, it's not okay to be powerful and not good. I get that part, but it's not okay not to be powerful. So anyway,
I don't know if that's just young people, Geoff. I think that's an archetypal struggle that humans go through, and I kind of I think of mortality as, if not the force, then one of the key forces that causes us to either step into our power or not, right? But it kind of puts us at that crossroads.
It also kind of relativizes things when we're talking about ethics, doesn't it? Because when you think about legacy, you're talking about a timeless kind of value as opposed to a momentary kind of value, which usually the lesser ethical choices
closer
represent.
to that. Yeah, I like this metaphor of the relay race and passing the baton. I feel like I got passed a bunch of batons by my grandparents and parents and teachers and whatever, and just run your part of the race. By the way, share batons on the way, but pass the batons. At the end. So anyway, that's sort of the arc of meaning for me.
I think of you gave a pretty pragmatic explanation of mortality and the role that it plays in a secular ethics, and I guess I see it as like an archetypal process that we have to go through. We mature because of our awareness of our mortality. We seek meaning because of our awareness of our mortality, and it seems very much a internal human experience to grapple with that.
And I wish our culture was more comfortable with our mortality. I say in the book, look, natural selection also taught us to fear death. Okay, so that's built in. We should fear death. But as a result, the way our culture is, and in the old days, in a religious model, the way you could accommodate fear of death, and you could still embrace mortality, and because you had the immortality vision behind it, and so you could look death in the face. If the problem with current society is it's not very good at looking death in the face, and so as a result, we have I mean, our vision of death is like people in hospital beds with tubes tied to themselves, and it's like, come on, we can do better than that. But we're so that's a place where I really would like to, because that archetypal struggle, or not struggle, but that archetypal tension you just described is made more complicated because we don't have a socially sophisticated, a secular socialization of death that would be as useful as the religious. The religious handling of death is extremely useful, really, really good. And we don't really have that with a secular thing, and we need something more there.
I wonder if that's where some Eastern philosophy, which is arguably more secular than religion, provides some answers. Like uh, the idea of attachment in Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that the Eastern, the taking the personality, the personalized deity, and making it more a field or impersonal, or something more being the word I was using, it does help. And I think the other thing that helps is, I mean, if you do have meditative like experiences, they do center you, and they do erode your fear of death at some level. I mean, it's like you're saying, okay, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I think it's okay. And that's really helpful, because in the absence of that, if it's just anxiety, it's not okay. And yeah,
And of course, that's going to drive behavior, and
yeah,
that's especially not okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And it's going to drive ethics, particularly because you realize that that little part of you maybe that thought it would get benefit from the non-ethical behavior, it really doesn't matter. It's
yeah,
really okay to not have that benefit. And
yeah.
when we were starting this podcast, that's why we use the image of the skull.
Oh, okay.
And I was thinking, a reference you might be the one of the few people that will get is I was thinking of Yorick
Yes, absolutely.
and
Yeah,
of the motivation, and that old idea mementi mori,
yes.
that we want to make our decisions based on that, and I think that that's a big part of that legacy idea.
It is, and yeah. So yes, and it's like, whatever the narrative is, it has to be both about us and not about us. It's got to be about us because we're the ones that need to be served. But we know we're temporary, so it's got to be about something. We have to participate in something that creates a context that's bigger than that. So that we can say, yes, that is what I am going to be in service to. I can find my place in that tradition, or that, or whatever it is. If you can't, and this is what was scary to me about some of the existentialist stuff that was coming out at one point, is that it's just like, man, so I mean, it just gets, I just, it's just, I'm impressed with their courage. I'm impressed with their authenticity, but I'm thinking, but where's the love? I mean,
It's
how do you,
pretty bleak.
yeah, yeah,
Well, and for me, there's always been this idea. The Hindus have this idea they call Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss.
yes, okay,
That if somehow, if we're in the right, if we're doing it all right, if we've got everything working, we're going to experience a juicier reality. Like the outcome is very pragmatic. And so, we've talked before about some of these old ideas of whether, and, I held the card up the other day or the other few moments ago, because I had written down being in service to,
yeah,
from other things that I had listened to that you had mentioned, and which really is a big, big part of it, I think. And I guess I want to believe, and this is maybe this is a metaphysics creeping back in. Are we going somewhere? Are we getting smarter? Do you believe in a teleology at all? Are we just circling the drain until the next chapter happens? Or are we going to get somewhere? Will there be a childhood's end? Will there be the eschaton? Will we attain oneness? Or is this a big metaphysical promissory note that we never get to cash?
well, so by the way, that part of narrative is the ending, right? And the whole point of the narrative, how did the plot end? And we talk about these narratives, the comic narrative and the heroic narrative and the tragic narrative and the absurdist narrative and kind of stuff, which is a little bit like what you just did. One of the ways I would contextualize this, however, is to say, as far as we can tell, the beginning was 13.2 or 4 billion years ago. And the end is heat death, and that's probably 8 to 10 billion years this way. So maybe what happens in the next 10 years isn't quite as important as we think it is. And so there's a part of me that just says, this is above my pay grade. I'm going to play along. And I don't know. It's above my pay grade.
You don't know, you don't have a sensibility for making progress at all, you think? Can't get you to climb out on that limb.
Well, of the four genres, I'm predisposed to comedy. And remember, in the comic genre, you're succeeding even though you don't deserve to. It's like I use Ferris Bueller as an example. It just kind of like you're just winning because the world's being very nice to you. I kind of have that sense of benignness somewhere, but I can't. Like, for example, Hegel had a really interesting. He had that whole teleology of where society advances through dialectic to increasing advanced places, and there's parts of it you go, well, certainly in the world of science and mathematics, we've certainly seen a bunch of that. In the world of human behavior, we haven't, and so it's like, where does that fit? But what I don't want to do is hitch my wagon to that kind of a horse. I want to stay more in the present, saying, look,
Right.
yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I think I know what I'm supposed to do right now. So
Right.
It's interesting because I think I interpreted some of what you've shared today and the book as making a statement about progress also, just by virtue of saying that I think earlier you said up until 200 years ago, the only underpinning for ethics was religion. And with the emergence of a rational secular worldview, we have a challenge of still integrating ethics. But that's a new chapter of how people think and operate, and certainly a new cultural chapter. And it makes me think, well, what's next? Is there a post rational or a hyper rational, or how I don't know how you would think about that, but
well, for me, it's like if you say what's next, this is like futurism, because there was faith popcorn and there are all these futurist people that do this stuff. It's like, again, I like the phrase, it's above my pay grade. And what I really mean by that is, look, there's a part of stuff that we can control, that we can be part of. And a lot of, I use the phrase a lot, play the hand you're dealt, because some people have been dealt some really, really bleak hands. And, you just have to play the hand you've been dealt. And so there's this bigger issue. Where are things going? Don't know. And I think that I get why people like to speculate about it, but it's like I have nothing to add at that point. Yeah.
fair enough.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good segue to something I wanted to ask, which is, what are you excited about?
Oh man, everything. Well, we've got grandchildren and children, so there's a whole family bunch of stuff that's really important. I'm excited about technology. I'm excited about artificial intelligence, with all the issues that are around it. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm excited to see what all the people I know are going to do next, and how they're going to do, and what's going on. I'm even a tiny bit excited about my golf game. So we're working on that right now. So that's kind of fun. I'm embarrassingly excited by what we're going to eat tonight, or any night. Marie is a wonderful cook, and then we go out to dinner a ton of times. And I think, obviously, I'm a mammal from that point of view, because I definitely, I wouldn't say I completely live to eat, but it's certainly up there in my things that get me excited. I worry about some things, but I'm not. A lot of things I worry about are things are beyond my control, and so at some point it's just like, no, stay focused on what you can do and just do that. That's kind of where we are right now.
A lot of that sounded really chapter appropriate in terms of really appreciating family. And that's an experience that I've had, is I've become more aware of my own mortality as family continues to get more important, and having dinner together regularly and having holidays together and things like that, and making sure my wife and I travel to see our various siblings around the country. And
Where
um,
are they, by the way? Where are you guys? Where are you, by the way? Where are you guys located?
right now I'm in Philadelphia.
That's right. And Brian, where are you?
I'm about 25 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I remember you tell that. And so Boaz, where's your family? And then Brian could ask you the same
My
question.
brother was living here in Princeton with his wife. They were both professors, one at Princeton, one at Temple, and they both got job offers at UC Berkeley at the same time that I was moving out to Philadelphia from New Mexico. So we literally
Brian,
moved.
whoa.
Yeah, and so we missed each other, which is, yeah, I'm honestly bummed about it. But we're going to California next week to visit them.
I
So
think you will. By the way, let's see. Saturday might be a little rain. The weather's been a little iffy this month, but anyway, it's still good. And did you guys meet when you were in Santa? Is that how you and Brian met when you were in New Mexico?
yeah, back, I would say, probably around 1997 we met, and I ended up buying a piece of land right across the arroyo from Brian, and he helped me build my off-grid house, using a lot of the learnings from his off-grid house. And I used to visit him a lot on the weekends, asking him for direction in life, and that's how these conversations
I
started,
love
and that
I,
was.
Brian. Is this Whole Earth catalog and Stuart Brand? I mean, is that where I was thinking about what when living off the grid started, and I don't know if the Whole Earth catalog got it into your. It was a big thing out in California for a while.
That's the Real Goods and Jade Mountain
Okay, good.
thing, yeah. But New Mexico has a rich heritage of off grid living, actually.
Well,
It's
presumably starting with the Pueblos. And,
well,
Well,
yeah.
in fact, someone visited me once and saw my house. He was a Navajo artist,
Uh-huh.
and he looked at my house in amazement, and he said, "That looks like my grandma's house."
Oh, a higher
Which
compliment he could not have
which
given you.
exactly, and I said, "I wish a lot of people were more on your and your grandma and my's page, but there was a cadre of young kids that are now, Boaz's age that, I think they were sort of maybe the beginning of that wave of looking for meaning,
Okay.
knowing that there's what we're given culturally, but there's a deeper dimension to it somehow.
Yeah.
And, a lot of my experiences were sort of looking in that direction. And so, very similar stuff to transcendental meditation or,
The other thing that's interesting for me is the Santa Fe Institute was where I first got exposed to complexity and complexity theory, and or emergence so that was I don't know if that I don't know how public that is because I've never actually been to the Santa Fe Institute, but it had a huge impact on my thinking.
yeah. I used to drive by it every day on my way up to the hiking trails, and they had some really interesting people over the years. I know Cormac McCarthy was involved with them, of all people.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good. Guys, we may be at the end of our conversation. It's okay if we are. I mean, it's fine.
It does have that
Yeah, yeah,
trajectory.
yeah.
I had two more questions for you.
Okay.
One is there anything important that we didn't ask that like, because you've encountered a lot of minds and a lot of minds grappling through this birthing of new thought into reality? Are there general advice that you would have for somebody? That's my first question. I'll save the second one till you finish.
Well, I think that when you said that to me, it made me think about the framework of the technology adoption life cycle and the point you already made, which is in the gestation of anything genuinely new, there are these stages. And so there's this early adopter innovation stage where you really need to be true to your vision. And even if your vision is being contradicted by other people, you need to find supportive community. You need to build it as best you can. But then there's this crossing the chasm thing where you've got to now encounter the people that are not part of your vision and how do you be in service to them. And then and a lot of times that's far enough, and the vision doesn't necessarily need to go to great scale, but occasionally with technology, when it does, we have this third stage we call the tornado, where basically it proliferates everywhere, and the challenge then is to be able to maintain maintain the integrity of the paradigm as it commoditizes, because it will commoditize like crazy. And then the fourth one is after we've absorbed it, then okay, now can we take advantage of it in more incremental ways? We call it Main Street, incremental sustaining innovations going forward. Yeah, if you think about what you're trying to do, where are you in that journey? And each of those, as you point out, each of those plays actually creates success in that state, but would actually prevent you from succeeding in the next phase. And so if people have that ambition to take things to scale, then that would be important. So that would be the thing I would add there.
Okay. And then my last question is Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, or the Earl of Oxford? If you want, I can say them again and you can just wink when one goes by.
You're trying to figure out who Shakespeare is? Oh my goodness! It's so funny for me because my dissertation was actually about a guy that Edmund Spencer, who was, and the reason it was interesting. I was reading the Fairy Queen, which by the way is a acquired taste to say the least. I mean, I suspect there are not 1,000 people on the planet that have read a Fairy Queen, but anyway, it was at the time it was quite the thing. But I was reading the first book was about Christianity. It's called the Red Cross Knight. And the second book was about temperance. So it was holiness and then temperance, and then chastity and friendship and a bunch of other ones. But temperance was the second book, and I thought there's something wrong with this story. This is there's something wrong with this narrative. I'm just going to figure this thing out. Well, what I ended up figuring out was that Spencer said there's limitations to temperance, because I was thinking it was supposed to be, a heroic story. He's a hero. It's obviously got to turn out perfectly. The last line of that particular book is, let's get the hell out of here. I mean, said a little bit more Elizabethan, but basically the heroes flee the scene in the last line of the poem. So it's like, what the hell? But anyway, what was fun about that was it's where I got involved with strategies for living literature, and realizing that literature is a laboratory to explore strategies for living, and that as readers we can identify with heroes and we can participate in the experiences fictionally, and that actually does shape. I mean, that's where we get not all our role models from, but we get a bunch of role models from them, like the westerns we were talking about with, Lucas McCain and people like that. Yeah.
Right. Wonderful.
Well, guys, thank you.
It's been an honor, a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I hope we can have you back sometime and keep in touch.
Okay, well, we'll see what your audience thinks before you do that.